Hi everyone. We're moving on to part 2 of the screen lecture on competition and community ecology, so chapter 52.1. So we talked about intra and inter-specific competition, and now I want to move on to thinking about the ecological niche or niche. I'm going to say it both ways, it's fine. I'm not French. So we can describe a species ecological niche in a bunch of different ways. There are a bunch of different definitions for it, but often the niche is actually drawn or represented on a two-dimensional graph where the x-axis is some indication of a resource or resource space, and it's usually a gradient of size or salinity or some other kind of sort of variation in the resource availability. And then the y-axis is how effective a species is at consuming that resource at those different levels. So this is sort of like an example across seed size. So this species can eat seeds at a high level in the medium size, and less effectively do they eat large or small seeds. You could also describe a niche verbally by saying a caddisfly larva, for example, lives in specific habitats in running streams. That's a perfectly good explanation of a niche in some contexts. So there's a bunch of definitions here. I like this one, the ecological role that a species plays, or the habitat requirements that allow a species to reproduce and persist. If you want to get real fancy and mathematical, Hutchinson defined a niche as an n-dimensional hypervolume. That's not particularly helpful. But basically the idea is that the dimensions here are environmental conditions and resources that define the requirements of an individual or a species to practice its way of life. So a niche is sort of hard to define, but you kind of know it when you see it. I'll show you a couple of other different definitions or pictures showing what an ecological niche is, so you can get your kind of mind around it. So here's a good one. The ecological niche describes the functional position of the organism in its environment, including the habitat, its activity patterns. That means like whether it's active during the day or night, the resources that it obtains from the habitat, all of these different things combine to make the niche. And you can see why it might be considered to be a multidimensional word. So different organisms have different niches, as you can sort of see in this picture. There's a stream flowing through some vegetation that has varying depths. And you can see that there are 3 different zones here that comprise 3 different ecological niches. The W zone includes shallow, fast-flowing oxygen-rich water, as opposed to zone P, which is slow-flowing, oxygen-limiting, and filtered by plants. So these are 2 different examples, really in close proximity, of different niches that might support different kinds of organisms in those spots. One more aquatic example. These are 4 or 5 different aquatic birds that require different kinds of niches that you can see here. You can go back and read it later, but it shows the different kinds of foods that each of these shorebirds are using in their habitat. And I think this point here is really important, so I'm going to say it out. I'm going to read you the whole thing out loud. All species that live in the same habitat, no matter how much their niche is in common, they have to have some differences between their niche in order to coexist, because they need to avoid competition. We've talked about competition being really negative, and that's true especially for organisms that have very similar niches, because they're competing for very similar resources in that case. So all species, no matter how many aspects in their niches have in common, there will always be some differences that allow them to avoid competition. All right, in the PowerPoint on Moodle, I'm going to ask you to click on this and actually watch this video. I can't show it here in this screencast, but you'll be able to see here and practice how to draw different niches for different kinds of organisms that have different requirements in their habitats, and think about that. So I definitely recommend watching and practicing drawing different kinds of niche models. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about like what happens to two different organisms or two different species when they are in competition with one another. The competitive exclusion principle is really important here, and that's, I referred to it earlier. The idea is, with the competitive exclusion principle, which you should know about, is that complete competitors cannot coexist. In other words, when species whose use of resources is very similar are trying to exist in the same place, they can't live in the same place for an extended period, at least theoretically. That is what we call the competitive exclusion principle. It was developed by a fellow named Gauss. That's not important. The idea is that complete competitors cannot coexist for extended periods of time in the habitat. So, in order to further understand this, we're going to explore the idea of the fundamental niche and the realized niche. So, the fundamental niche is a defined, at least in the context of this class, as the total range of environmental conditions where a species can exist and can survive. So this includes, again, all sorts of different conditions: temperature and food availability and soil type, or I don't know, wind speed, all different kinds of things that can comprise a niche. Like where is that organism able to survive? As opposed to the realized niche, which is it's a subset of the fundamental niche that's actually occupied by the species in real life. Sometimes the fundamental niche might be reduced by competition, and the individuals for that species are kind of constrained, and they only live in part of the fundamental niche. They live in their realized niche. There's a nice picture of this that you can see here. This might help a little bit. So here we've got graphs that have two different variables, temperature on the x-axis and sunlight on the y-axis. So we can think about different kinds of diatoms or different kinds of water organisms that live, and we can sort of say this species of organisms tends to live in the sort of a broad area, like a broad set of temperatures and a broad availability of sunlight. They can survive in all of this niche space here. Now, it turns out, though, that if these are actually parasitic organisms or competitors with another organism, the realized niche, even though these critters can survive in low temperature, high sunlight environments or high temperature, low sunlight environments, in general, they're not found there in nature. Their realized niche is much reduced because of their actual interactions with other species around. So the realized niche takes into account like biotic factors like competitive interaction and the availability of hosts that they need in order to live there, for example. So, going back to the idea of competitive exclusion, what happens to the distribution and growth of populations when two species niches do overlap with each other? So let's check this out. What are the consequences of competition is another way to think about this. And there's two basic ideas, two possibilities of what's going to happen if two species come into competition and their niches overlap, especially if they overlap a lot. One is competitive exclusion, as we've said, and the other is coexistence. So what will determine whether two species can actually live in the same environment or if one is going to be completely excluded from the environment by those competitive interactions? Coexistence occurs if the species can differentiate the niche and split it up such that the competition doesn't eliminate one of the species. This is called niche differentiation. Sometimes it's called resource partitioning, and we'll talk about it a lot more in a little while. We're going to get to character displacement in a little while too. So coexistence of two species with overlapping niches often results in selection and evolution so that the species no longer actually exploit the same kind of niche. They sort of evolve to avoid competition if they can. So one literal textbook example of competitive exclusion occurs with paramecia. So these are paramecium. They are single-celled little organisms. I think of them as like little bed slippers. Sometimes they have little cilia around them. They can move around. They are consumers, so they eat other food. They're not photosynthetic. And they are aquatic organisms. So they are little protists that live in water and they hang around. We're going to talk about two players right now, Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium caudatum. And you can see if you grow them separately in their own sort of aquatic habitats, in their own little test tubes, they have very similar growth curves. So you start off with a very small number of them and you let them grow on their own and do their thing and split. They split and divide. And they both grow very similarly and have about the same population size if you give them the same amount of resources. What happens when you put them in competition, though? What would happen if you put both species over time in the same environment? And you can sort of try to predict yourself, but I'm just going to show you. What ends up happening is that P. aurelia totally excludes P. caudatum, and you can do this over and over again in different kinds of scenarios. And this is the classic example of competitive exclusion shown in the lab. So if you put these two species in the same place, P. caudatum gets competitively excluded. And I'll just point out that P. aurelia has smaller numbers than they would if they were grown alone. And that's just to remind you that competition causes harm to all of the species, even the winners in this case. So this is competitive exclusion, where the weaker competitor in that environment is eliminated altogether. And that occurs when there's asymmetrical competition, where one species consistently will have a higher fitness in that resource space than the other. That's going to cause, when A and B are together, that's going to cause the species with higher fitness in that area to be excluded consistently. It also occurs if the niches of those two species overlap completely. The weaker competitor is going to be driven to local extinction in that community if the competitor, if its competitor has a completely overlapping niche. The one that can exploit it more effectively is going to competitively exclude the weaker competitor. On the other hand, what happens if the resource patterns do not overlap completely? So in this case, even though there is some resource overlap of the species, species 1 tends towards smaller seeds and species 2 tends towards larger seeds. What should happen in this situation? And I want you to sort of think about it for a little bit. How might competition here cause a change in the populations of each species over time to reduce the competitive interactions that are going to cause individuals to have lower fitness where their resource use overlaps? I'll say that again. What happens in the area where competitive interactions are lowering the fitness of those individuals that are competing? And that's what I'm asking here as well. I think a good hint to think about this is to think, which individuals of species 2 are going to have the lowest fitness out of all of the individuals in species 2 due to the competition? Which individuals are going to have the lowest fitness in response to the competition, and what might that do to the populations over multiple generations if the food exploitation is underlain by heritable traits? Okay, I'm going to pause there and go on to the third and hopefully final example of a video for this section.